Matthew chapter 13 this morning. Matthew chapter 13. On Sunday nights, we've been preaching a little bit on the home. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked to the husbands. And so tonight, I'll preach to the wives tonight. So gentlemen, if you want to come, that's open to you. I'll preach to the wives. Be very positive and encouraging and uplifting, as I am known to be. Wednesday night, Brother John Allen will be with us, missionary of Papua New Guinea. That'll be a real blessing. Well, we got some good preachers in February. Dr. Gibbs last week, Brother Adam Thompson, John Allen. And so praise the Lord for that. Preaching through a book like we do in the Gospel of Matthew on Sunday morning means that when you come to a passage, you come to a passage. It is what it is. You don't get to just pick easy ones. When you come to a hard one, that just, verse 31 happens to be the verse after verse 30. And that just, you come to it. In Matthew 13, we're dealing with the kingdom parables. And this morning, we're looking at verse 31, verse 32, and verse 33. There are two parables, the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven. And the Lord is teaching these parables really as judgment of the people's rejection of Him. Because of their rejection, He begins teaching in parables. A parable is meant to conceal truth to the unbeliever, while at the same time revealing truth to those who have faith. These parables are of the mystery form of the kingdom, some truth that has never been related or been taught before. And this morning, because of the text, the nature of the text, this morning is going to be more teaching than preaching. It just lends itself to that. And so it's a little bit more like a Wednesday night Bible study, and so you've got to really listen on purpose. And then the second thing that I want to say at the very beginning is that when you look at the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven, there is a very standard, common interpretation of those two parables. And the more that I've looked at it and the more that I've studied it, I'm not sure that I'm in total agreement with the standard interpretation. And so this morning, the way that I'm going to approach these two parables is I'm going to take a different angle than what, if you've ever heard these two parables preached, then I can almost guarantee, with a 99% certainty, what was preached. And this morning, I'm going to go a different direction with them. The thing about it is that when I'm done, if you say, man, he's spot on or he's way off, then we'll not break fellowship. It won't be heresy, okay? It's just a different way of looking at it. And I hope that you'll give me a fair hearing this morning. I tell you, yesterday all day I was thinking, man, I'll just do something else and give myself some more time. But I believe I've got it down. And so let's read it this morning and we'll get started. But Matthew 13 and verse 31, another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Another parable spake he unto them, the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. We've looked at 2 parables so far. The first parable was the parable of the sower. A man goes out, he sows seed, and it falls on 4 types of ground. And the lesson behind that parable was that in this age there would be a lot of seed sown, but not all of it would produce fruit. You can expect some hard ground, some rejection, some shallow commitment. You can expect Satan to snatch away some of the seed. But you can also expect some of the seed to fall on good ground and produce good fruit. That's the parable of the sower. Then the second parable is the parable of the tares. Another man goes out and he sows wheat in his field, and he's expecting a crop. But while he sleeps, an enemy goes out and he sows tares in the same field. It is not detected until both of them are coming up together. And instead of sending servants out to try to pull up the tares, the owner of the field says, let them both grow together. And in the end, when it's harvest time, then the reapers will come and they'll separate the wheat from the tares. We believe that the truth of that parable is that in this age, there will be a lot of false teaching sown by Satan, and there will be a lot of false believers. There will be believers and unbelievers growing up together. However, we are not to go out and try to kill the unbelievers. This judgment is not given to us, and we don't try to separate that. You let the tares and the wheat grow together, and when it's harvest time, the Lord will send His angels, the reapers, they'll come, and they'll separate the believers from the unbelievers. That's the parable of the tares. The third parable that we come to this morning is the parable of the mustard seed. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice about this parable and the parable of the leaven is there is no explanation given for them. When Jesus gave the parable of the sower, the parable of the tares, the disciples came to Him later on and said, show us the meaning. Tell us what these parables mean. And so at another time, Jesus explained to them, away from the multitude, explained to them the interpretation of the parable of the sower and the parable of the tares. But they did not ask for an explanation on these two parables, and there is no explanation given. Even in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Luke, where these parables are repeated, there is no explanation given. Now, for that reason, men have made up all kinds of fanciful interpretations, and this parable has been subject to all kinds of wild ideas. So we look at the parable, we look at the text, and we try to decipher what is the message of this parable. So the first thing that I want you to notice in this parable is the significance of the mustard seed. Like the two parables before, this is a parable taken from farming. A man goes out and he sows a field with mustard seed. That seed, which is a very small seed, grows into something very large, a very large plant. So what happens is something small becomes something very great. Now, in the parable of the sower, the seed that was sown is the Word of God. In the parable of the tares, the wheat and the tares are the believers and unbelievers. So you come to the parable of the mustard seed. What is the mustard seed? I'm going to let the cat out of the bag, tell you what I think it is, and then you got to give me time to demonstrate that. I believe that the parable, for lack of a better way to explain this, is the kingdom itself. Now bear in mind there is a spiritual aspect to the kingdom. There is obviously a physical aspect to the kingdom. But it starts out very small. It ends up very large. Significance of the mustard seed. The second thing that we are told about is the size of the mustard seed. The emphasis in the parable is how small the mustard seed is, but how large of a plant that it becomes. Now there is a phrase found in verse number 32 where Jesus says it is indeed the least of all seeds. And some Bible critics have jumped onto that and say, no, there's a mistake in the Bible. Because the mustard seed is actually not the smallest seed known to man. There is a seed that is actually smaller. It's the wild orchid seed. So Jesus says this is the least of all seeds, but now we know something maybe Jesus didn't know, and there's actually a seed that is smaller. And I look at this two ways. The mustard seed is the smallest seed that a man would plant. It doesn't come up wild like a wild orchid seed. And Jesus is giving an illustration of a man planting something very small. And the smallest thing that a man would plant would be a mustard seed. The second way that I look at this is that Jesus is referencing only seeds that the people would be familiar with. He's dealing with seeds that they would know about. I mean, I suppose he could have said that the mustard seed is the least of all seeds. However, there is a seed that is found in America that's smaller. They wouldn't know where America was at. They wouldn't have a reference point for that, all right? And so as far as they knew, the mustard seed was the smallest seed, and that's what Jesus used for the illustration. And you have to understand that Jesus is not giving a botany lesson. He's using a proverb. And it actually was one of the common Jewish proverbs to talk about something as small as a mustard seed. In a couple of chapters, I think in Matthew 17, Jesus will say that if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. That was a proverb that they used all the time. Now, what does the parable mean? The kingdom of heaven will be like a mustard seed that when it is sown, it is small. At this point in Matthew chapter 13, the kingdom of heaven really exists of about 12 people. It was Jesus and his followers, and there was a lot of opposition against them. They were just a handful against the political and the religious world. And Jesus is telling them that this thing starts small, but it's going to grow into something much bigger. The disciples are small. They have very little influence. Often they are weak in faith. And it doesn't look like a very big start to the kingdom. They've got about as much significance as a mustard seed. However, not only will the kingdom start small, it's going to grow into something very large. If you read the Old Testament prophets, their expectation of the kingdom was not a small, out-of-the-way, regional, local thing. In fact, hold your finger here. Go to Psalm chapter 72 this morning. Psalm chapter 72, a little bit of a Bible study, but this is the only way I know to preach this. Psalm 72, we'll pick up a couple of references. And Psalm 72 in verse number 8, he shall have dominion also from sea to sea, from the river unto the ends of the earth. They that dwell in the wilderness shall bow before him. His enemies shall lick the dust. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him. All nations shall serve him. It has a small beginning, but it's going to grow into a large tree. Look at Isaiah chapter 54. Isaiah chapter number 54, and look at verse number 2. Enlarge the place of thy tent. Let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, strengthen thy stakes, for thou shalt go forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles and make the desolate cities to be established. His kingdom is going to grow so large, it's going to encompass all the other kingdoms of the world. In fact, Revelation chapter 11 says that the kingdoms of the world have become the kingdoms of the Lord and of Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So when you put the two parts together, what you have is a kingdom that may seem small and insignificant and even trodden under, but one day it's going to fill the whole earth. Now, I'm very careful when I'm in Matthew chapter 13 to make a distinction between the kingdom and the church. They are not the same. The church is in the kingdom, but they are not the same. But I believe that we can apply the same principle to the church. Because sometimes if we're not careful, we can get discouraged and get crowded out by the world. And it seems like that maybe we're the only ones serving the Lord and we're a very small, minor crowd. And how do you think the disciples felt when Jesus died? Because it started out going pretty strong with John the Baptist preaching, and great crowds were coming to him, and there was a groundswell of support, and then Jesus dies. Now what's going to happen? And those disciples probably felt thin the same way that we can feel now. And Jesus says, look, the kingdom may be small now, but the kingdom that you're a part of will one day stretch from sea to sea and will cover the face of the earth. You come to the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, that church had 120 members in the upper room. And here's the thing about it, that was the only church then. It was the only church left, and thy seed shall inherit. In Pickens, South Carolina. In Pickens, South Carolina, they said they have 95 independent Baptist churches in Pickens, South Carolina. Can you imagine 95 independent Baptist churches? Well, if you want to be a church hopper, you go to a different church in 2 years and even come to the same church. Wouldn't that be a blessing? But in Acts chapter 1, this is the only church. So in all of Christendom in Acts 1, you got 120. That's a really small beginning. But within a few chapters, there are multitudes and thousands getting saved. 3,000 one Sunday, 5,000 the next Sunday. And now today, Christianity has influence all over the world. And just like Christ himself had a humble beginning, so did the church. But just like Christ has touched the world, so has the church. So you have the significance of the mustard seed. You have the size of the mustard seed. Here's where it gets tricky, the sanctuary in the mustard seed. Because the mustard seed not only starts out small, grows to a very large tree. It is so large that birds come and they build their nest there. That's what it says in the last part of verse 32. It becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Now again, Jesus doesn't tell us what the birds are. So we're left to guess. Now the most common idea is that the birds are demons or evil influence. In the first parable, you remember how that the sower sowed seed and some fell by the wayside and the birds came and snatched it up. And when Jesus interpreted that parable later in the chapter, he identified the birds as Satan. So since birds in one parable is Satan, then we carry that over and say, well, it must be that birds are Satan in this parable as well. So the common idea is that Jesus is saying that the kingdom will start small, it'll grow big, but it will be marked with sin and error and evil influence and satanic influence that is perched in her branches trying to tear it apart. The idea is that the three parables, the parable of the tare, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the leaven go together, and they all three speak of opposition during the kingdom. And so in the parable of the tares, you have false believers. In the parable of the mustard seed, you have false growth. In the parable of the leaven, you have false doctrine. That's the standard interpretation. However, when I look at just verse 31 and verse 32, there is no hint in those verses that the birds are bad things, or that the birds are there to destroy the mustard tree. I can't find anything in here to suggest that the birds are demons or evil influence. And so I thought, why do birds lodge in the branches of a tree? That seems to be a natural thing for them to do. Well, they lodge in a tree for safety, for shelter, for food, to build a nest, to raise their young. The birds are not enemies of the tree. The tree is a natural place for them to be. And so I will go out on a limb myself this morning. I don't believe that the birds are demons. I don't believe it's the devil. I believe that the birds are either people or nations that are blessed in the kingdom. Now let me show this to you. The picture of birds in a tree is actually found in several places in the Old Testament. And it is a picture of prosperity and blessing. It's always a good thing, not a bad thing. Hold your finger, go to Psalm number 104. Still with me, say amen. Amen. Bible study this morning, I understand. Psalm 104, and look at verse number 10. Psalm 104, verse number 10. He sendeth the springs into the valleys, which run among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild asses quench their thirst. By them shall the fowls of the heaven have their habitation, which sing among the branches. It's a picture of blessing and prosperity. Look at Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter number 4. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a vision, and he needs help interpreting that vision. Daniel chapter 4, look if you would in verse number 10. He says, these were the visions of mine head in my bed. Now watch his vision. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and all the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all, or the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. Nebuchadnezzar has this vision, and there is a tree, and it's so large, it reaches all the way into the heavens, and beasts came and they fed from it, and the fowls of the air lodged in the branches of that tree. Well, what was that tree? We'll look down in verse number 20. Daniel's going to interpret it. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached into the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong, for thy greatness is grown, and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. The king of Babylon in the Babylon Empire, it is depicted as a giant tree with birds resting in it and beasts that are having shade under it and feeding off of it, and it is a picture of blessing. So in Matthew chapter 13, when Jesus says that here's a picture of a great tree and it has birds in it, he could be borrowing from Daniel to show that it's a prosperous kingdom. Look in Ezekiel chapter 31. You don't look convinced, so keep going. Ezekiel chapter 31. Ezekiel chapter 31, verse number 3. Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon with fair branches, with a shadowing shroud and of an high stature. His top was among the thick boughs. And the waters made him great. The deep set him up on high with her rivers running round about his plants and sent out her little rivers unto all the trees of the field. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shot forth. All the fowls of heaven made their nests there. You see that? The Assyrian Empire is described as a massive world empire, and other kingdoms found shelter and found safety and security in that empire. Look at Ezekiel chapter 17. It's seen as a blessing. It's a good thing. Look at Ezekiel chapter 17 and look at verse number 22. Thus saith the Lord God, I will also take of the highest branch of the high cedar and will set it. I will crop off from the top of his young twigs a tender one, and will plant it upon a high mountain and eminent. In the mountain of the height of Israel will I plant it. It shall bring forth boughs and bear fruit, and be a goodly cedar, and under it shall dwell all fowl of every wing. In the shadow of the branches thereof shall they dwell. It's a messianic prophecy. It's the same kingdom that Jesus is speaking of in Matthew chapter 13. It grows into a great kingdom, and the fowls come and they lodge in it, and that is seen as a prosperous thing. So here's what I believe is the message of the parable of the mustard seed, and you can go back to Matthew 13. I believe that what it is saying is that the kingdom is going to start small. It's going to be marked by a sowing of the word. There will be much opposition. There will be seed that is snatched away, and the devil will do all that he can to wreak havoc upon the kingdom. He's going to sow tares among the wheat, and you'll have to wait for God to sort it out in the end. But the kingdom, it'll be small and it'll be insignificant, and the powers of the world will give it to no attention, but it's going to grow, and it's going to grow, and it's become a massive tree, and all the nations of the earth and people of the earth are going to come to it and find food and shelter and prosperity and blessing. I believe that that's what the parable is talking about. Then you come to verse 33. You have the parable of the leaven. Look at verse 33. Another parable spake he unto them. The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. Now again, you have a parable and no explanation. You have one sentence, and that's all that you have. There is a woman. She is kneading meal to bake bread, and she takes a little bit of leaven and she hides it in the meal. And eventually the entire measure of meal becomes leavened. Leaven is it's yeast. I'm not a baker. I am told it is what makes the bread rise. Unleavened bread is flat. It's tasteless. You put leaven, you put yeast in it or sourdough in it, and it makes it rise. And what they would do is they would take a new batch of dough, and they would take a piece of fermented dough, and they would put it in it, and that dough would ferment the rest of it. Now, here's a woman who has 3 measures of meal. 3 measures of meal is equivalent to an ephah, which is a lot. It is a lot of meal. And leaven would just be a small amount. So when you hide this small amount of leaven in this big basket of meal, but yet that small amount of leaven influences the entire 3 measures of meal. And here's the thing about it. The influence that it has over the meal is a good thing. It doesn't poison the bread. She doesn't put it in there trying to ruin the bread. It makes it rise. It gives it texture. So when I look at this parable, I look at the picture in the leaven. And here's the thing about it. When you think of leaven in the Bible, you know that leaven is usually cast in a negative light. Jesus said, beware of the leaven of Herod. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Beware of the leaven of the Sadducees. Sometimes leaven is a picture of hypocrisy and dishonesty in the religious world. Galatians 5 and verse number 9 warns against the leaven of legalism. In Exodus chapter 12, when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, they were to bake unleavened bread on the Passover. The meal offering was not to have any leaven in it. So there is a negative connotation to leaven, but I believe that you have to keep it in context. Because leaven is negative in one place, doesn't mean that it is negative in every other place. I read one writer last night who said that leaven is mentioned 95 times in the Bible. I haven't counted it. He said leaven is mentioned 95 times in the Bible, and every single instance, without question, it is negative. I disagree. You cannot say that it's negative absolutely without question in this passage. But besides, how about at the Feast of Pentecost? At the Feast of Pentecost, they baked 2 loaves of bread. One's Israel, one's Gentile, and that bread was leavened. And so the Lord, and by the way, the Lord's comparing His kingdom to leaven. Look what He says. The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven. It's like leaven. He's not contrasting, He's comparing it. So it's a hard time seeing Jesus comparing His kingdom to something that is evil. So here, I don't believe that in this context that the leaven is sin or evil influence. Now, if you believe that leaven is evil influence, then I'm not going to quarrel with you, all right? Again, there's 2 standard interpretations, and I'm trying to be honest and give you both of them. The standard interpretation among most commentators, and I picked up a commentary in my library at 1045 and looked through a guy that is a great Bible teacher, and he takes a completely different approach than what I'm taking, but we're not told the meaning of the leaven. And here's what I believe that verse 33 is saying, is that the dough, the meal, is like the world, and the leaven is the influence of the kingdom or the gospel or Christendom or Christianity. And when it is placed in the world, it has a positive influence over the entire world. You plant something as powerful as the kingdom in the world, it's going to influence the entire earth. I believe that the leaven in this case is the good influence of Christ, the gospel, the church, the kingdom on the earth. And so secondly, we have the permeation of the leaven. And I want you to think about something. Leaven is something that permeates, whether it's good or bad. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse number 6, know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? A little bit influences and affects the whole thing. Whether it's good or bad, it's going to have a huge influence. If you're talking about sin, then a little bit of sin in the church can influence the entire church. It's akin to saying that one rotten apple will spoil the whole barrel of apples, right? So Paul said in verse number 7, purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, even as ye are unleavened. You're a Christian now, so don't bring any of that stuff from the old life over into your new life. You see, whenever they made a batch of bread, they would take that dough, they would always pinch a little piece of that off, and they would set it off to the side, and they baked their bread. And this would ferment, and then whenever they went to make another bread, they would bring that over into the old, into the new, and they would make it up, and then they'd take a pinch of that off, and they would continue doing that. And what Paul is saying is cut that off. Don't bring any of that over into the new life, which is why when the children of Israel left Egypt and they said, bake unleavened bread, because where are you going to get the leaven from? Well, you're going to get it from Egypt, and it's symbolic of cutting that off. We're not bringing that over. We're done with Egypt is what it is. It talks about influence. They say that when a Jewish girl got married, her mother would give her symbolic gifts. And one of the symbolic gifts that she would give her was a piece or a pinch of leaven out of the last batch of dough that she baked before she's married. And she would take that leaven or that yeast and she would use it in the first batch of bread that she baked in her new home. And it was symbolic of bringing blessings into that home. It wasn't a bad thing, it was a good thing. So I look at the leaven in this bread as influence. And it is true that evil has a corrupting influence, but the truth in the gospel has influence as well. There's a commentator named William Arnott, and he wrote a commentary, and here's what he said. He said, the evil spreads like leaven. You tremble before its stealthy advance and relentless grasp. But be of good cheer, disciples of Jesus. Greater is he that is for you than all that are against you. The word of life, which has been hidden in the world, hidden in believing hearts, is a leaven too. The unction of the Holy One is more subtle and penetrating and subduing than sin and Satan. Where sin abounded, grace shall much more abound. And I tend to agree with that. Jesus knew the analogy of leaven to evil. But as pervasive and permeating and as unstoppable as evil in the world is, so is the gospel. So is the gospel. And so the kingdom of heaven, it's like a woman who puts a little bit of leaven in a huge measure of meal, and it influences the entire measure of meal. And the point is not that the leaven is good or evil. The point is that the leaven is pervasive. It permeates. It influences. And in this case, the effect that it has on the measure of meal is desirable. She puts it in that meal for that purpose, and it has a good effect. And I believe that's how the kingdom would work. Remember, this is the mystery of the kingdom, not a picture of the millennial reign. This is the kingdom on earth. In his absence, it is this present age. And what is going to happen is the gospel is going to go forth, and there's going to be much opposition, but Christianity is going to spread, and it's going to influence the entire earth. And isn't it amazing how the church itself started with such a small number, but yet Christianity has influence over nations and empires for the last 2 millenniums. You think of the missionaries that have gone out from the church into remote regions of the world. Think of the hospitals and the medical clinics and the children's homes and the orphanages that have all been started in the name of Christianity. And I believe that Jesus is saying is that you're like leaven in that measure mirror. You're going to be hid, but before it's over, your influence is going to be felt all over. The gospel will go forth in this age. There'll be much hard opposition. There'll be a hard soil, and Satan's going to snatch some seed away. But some seed falls on good ground, and the enemy's going to wreak havoc by planting tares among the wheat, and just let them go together. And God will send his angels, and he'll do the reaping and separate the tares from the wheat in the end. And in spite of all of this evil opposition, that mustard seed is going to grow, and that leaven is going to influence, and it's going to start out real small, but it's going to get real, real big. It's going to be a blessing to a lot of people. And just like a little pinch of leaven in a huge measure of meal, you'll feel the influence of Christ and Christianity all over the world. Now, that's what I believe is the interpretation of those two parables. Now, what does it mean? How much am I influencing the world around me? How much am I doing my part? I'll give you an illustration. And I wish that I could reverse this illustration, but I'll be honest in the pulpit. I quit carrying a wallet in my back pocket because of hip pain and what have you. They said that's bad for you. So I just carry a wallet just with all my credit cards and what have you. And here's what I've done is in my wallet every day I put 2 gospel tracts in that wallet. And my objective is to pass out 2 gospel tracts a day. If I go to a convenience store or wherever it might be, and that helps me. That's a reminder for me. Now that's a small thing, passing out a little gospel tract. That's not very big, is it? That's little. But you know, if one person gets a gospel tract and reads and gets saved, that's a big influence. Big influence. I've gotten off a lot of sweets. I've kind of fallen off the wagon in the last week. Not my fault of the church I was at. And since I'd fallen off the wagon and was already off the wagon, so this morning I went to Milton Bakery. I've already sinned, and so, you know. And so I go into Milton Bakery, and there's a lot of people standing there. I've got my wallet. And standing in front of me was a guy, I don't know how to say this, Rastafarian? What long hair that way down, scraggy. And I opened up my wallet, and I had a gospel tract. And it would be a wonderful illustration for me to tell you that I gave him a gospel tract and he got saved. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't give him a gospel tract. Now, I wish I could tell you that I did, and I didn't. I should have. And I'd be lying to tell you that I did. But I tried to pass out 2 a day. 2 a day. Now, it's a very small thing, but what a great influence that gospel has. You see, when I read these 2 parables, instead of discouraging me, they are encouraging if I've read it right. And what it says is keep living for Jesus. Keep witnessing to your neighbor. Keep praying. We're on the winning side. We're not just holding on until Jesus gets back and hanging on by the... That's not us. We have the greatest opportunity, the greatest means and the methods, the greatest message. And we can go out in the power of the Holy Spirit and touch a world for Jesus Christ. That's the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of Leaven. And you go home and you read it and you say, I think that it means something totally different. Then the next time you get to preach it, then you get to preach it that way. Let's stand together. Boy, I know, tough on a Sunday